This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So thanks very much for being here this morning. I want to introduce our speaker, Dan Matlock from Colorado. We're really lucky to have Dan here and appreciate him making the trip out. Dan grew up in Colorado, did undergraduate at Colorado School of Mines, and then med school at University of Colorado and residency at University of Colorado, training in geriatrics and palliative care there as well, and a master's in public health. Dan is really, I think, has been a really important pioneer in the world of shared decision-making, and that's become increasingly important for us in cardiology in a lot of domains. We've enjoyed starting to partner with Dan on some projects, and I think he really is, well, clearly one of the leaders in this field, but is I think, a really nice example of commitment to rigor and also to understanding clinical realities in the context of trying to think through this. He also spends a lot of his time thinking about implementation science and is really committed to development of tools that can be used in meaningful ways in real clinical practice. So it's a treat to have Dan here. We appreciate your making the trip.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. So, yeah, like you said, I'm Dan Matlock from Colorado, and the other piece of that story is my wife isn't leaving Colorado. We met in high school, and that's why everything I've done is in Colorado, and everything I will do is in Colorado. So the title of my talk is Shared Decision-Making in Implantable Defibrillators. Some conflicts of interest. I've had grant support from the American College of Cardiology Foundation, the NIH, PCORI, AFAR, Hartford Foundation, and the Colorado Health Foundation. And I tell people, especially when I talk to cardiologists, I'm actually a member of the ACC, and they allow geriatricians to be a member for about $100, but you have to fill out this application and get 2 letters, and then you have to check a box that you're either a CV veterinarian or a geriatrician. I'm not sure what that says about the ACC, but I'm thankful to them for letting me be a member at this discounted rate. So before we get too far, I just think about this quote. There's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. And think about it if you were trying to explain that to, say, a 10-year-old. So Gerd Gigerenzer, he's a health psychologist in Germany at the Max Planck Institute. He does a lot of research in health communication. He did this study where he asked 750 people on the street in 5 cities, what does this mean? He gave them 3 options. It'll rain tomorrow in 30% of the region, 30% of the time, or 30% of the days like tomorrow. The most common answer was it'll rain tomorrow for 30% of the time. And the last one is the right answer. And maybe more telling is what some of the people said in their comments. 3 out of 10 meteorologists believe it will rain. 30% means if you look up at the sky and see 100 clouds and 30 of them are black. It's not about time, it indicates the amount of rain that will fall. And then this last one's my favorite because I think it's correct. If we had 100 lives, it would rain in 30 of these tomorrow. But that gets into our challenge just as humans thinking probabilistically, and that's a lot of what the psychologists have published on, is that our brains don't really think in terms of future probability. We have to work really hard to even understand what that means. And that has a lot of implications for how we talk to patients about, because almost everything we do is about some future probability. So a brief overview of this talk. I'll talk a little bit about why shared decision-making is a thing. And then I'll talk about what are shared decision-making and patient decision aids. And then I'll get at the end where I think the big problem is, or the big challenge is, I should say, how does one implement shared decision-making and patient decision aids? I actually think that's where the big rub is. So why shared decision-making? So this gets, this first part's just a little bit preachy. But the IOM talks about these domains of quality: safe, effective, equitable, efficient, timely, and patient-centered. And the way they define patient-centered is providing care that is respectful of and responsive to individual patient preferences, needs, and values, and ensuring that patient values guide all clinical decisions. So that's what they mean by patient-centered care. And I like to talk about this briefly because the term patient-centered gets thrown around a lot. We should do patient-centered outcomes. And what sometimes people mean by that is they're doing a quality of life measure, which in my opinion, that might be an effective outcome. If you have some intervention that improves quality of life, that's more effective. Whereas patient-centered really, as they define it, is really about values driving decisions. So getting into the example, this is the SCUD-HEF trial. This is the big trial, for those who don't know, that caused Medicare to approve implantable defibrillators for the primary prevention of sudden death. Heart failure patients who hadn't had a previous potentially lethal arrhythmia, randomized to either an ICD or placebo. At the time they started the trial in '99, there was an amiodarone arm because there was still a question of maybe antiarrhythmics were just as good. And you could see amiodarone was not just as good. It was about like placebo. But defibrillators were, I would argue, wildly beneficial. Over 5 years, in the placebo arm, 36% of people died, whereas 29% of people in the ICD arm died. As far as preventive medicine goes, this is a big absolute risk reduction. This certainly beats a lot of things I do in primary care with cholesterol and hypertension. And this is how this gets framed, though. This is an advertisement that showed up in our mailbox from our electrophysiology group. This was 8 or 10 years ago now that this ad showed up, but they said, here's the recent landmark device trials from one of the companies. And it says here there's a 23% reduction in the risk of all-cause mortality in ICDs compared to conventional drug therapy versus placebo. And this gets into that. I just showed you the slide before and said there's a 7% reduction. That's an absolute risk. And here's how these things get presented, the relative risk. And I think this is one of the challenges. So this is a survey we did of all patients with defibrillators in Kaiser. And we asked them, if 100 people like you had an ICD, how many lives would be saved over the next 5 years? And I just told you the right answer is 7. But you can see what a lot of the patients thought what the right answer was. 40% thought it was 53 or greater. 20% thought it was 28. And about 15% had the right answer of 7. And this is not unique to ICDs. There's a lot of data in a lot of therapies that patients tend to overestimate the benefits and they tend to underestimate the risks. And I say tend because where that underestimate the risks falls apart is when you get into really rare risks. Then people start to overestimate the risks because they hear this long list of risks, say on a pharmaceutical ad on TV, and some of those might be 1 in 100,000, but people just hear risk. It's actually a really interesting study, I think by Peter Ubel was part of this too, with Michigan, where they, when he was at Michigan, where they looked at 1 in a million versus 2 in a million, and they gave people this risk, and people who heard that there was 2 in a million thought 2 weeks later that the risk was actually lower than people who heard the risk is 1 in a million. And the idea is that when you hear 1 in a million, you don't remember the number, you just hear risk, because it's sort of a 1 in a million. Whereas when you hear 2 in a million, you think about, 2 over a million, that's kind of small, okay, small risk. And you ask those people later, but when they don't remember the number, they just thought the risk was lower if they heard 2 in a million over 1 in a million. So, but short of those kinds of examples, the research, I think, tends to show that people overestimate the risks, underestimate the benefits, or vice versa. So with ICDs, there are trade-offs I like to talk about. There's obviously procedural risks. These are pretty small, I would argue. There's some data that people with defibrillators have increased heart failure admissions. This came from the Made It True trial. The idea there is you take people who would have died of sudden death and kept them alive. So they've kind of proven themselves to be a sicker population. So it's hard to know what I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing. There's data on anxiety, depression, and PTSD. I think somewhat unfortunately, the big trials where this was randomized, where we could really get an attributable rate of these to the ICDs, didn't really report it. We know patients with ICDs have rates of anxiety and depression that are 30%, and we know people with heart failure have rates of anxiety and depression that are 30%. So it's really hard to know how much of that is attributable. Certainly some PTSD, I bet most people have had some experiences with patients who've had PTSD from getting shocked. Inappropriate shocks, that's gotten a lot better with new programming and advances in the technology. Device malfunction. Nate Goldstein at Mount Sinai has published some great papers on suffering at the end of life with an ICD. He had one survey where he surveyed hospices in the country. This was about 10 years ago, and half the hospices in the country had a patient on hospice get shocked by their ICD while they were there dying of another cause. I think that's gotten better in the last 10 years as ICDs have become more common. Hospice and hospice nurses are more aware that it's not just a pacemaker. But I'm not sure medicine gets much worse than that, than somebody dying of cancer in a hospice that starts getting shocked by their ICD when the family's standing around. And then quality of life, this data is also pretty mixed. There's some data, if you get shocked more than 3 times, quality of life goes down. But I list it as a potential harm because I think for some people this is true. I don't think that the data necessarily says the ICDs lower quality of life. But I actually think that's not where the trade-off with the defibrillator is. I think this is where the trade-off is. It's in this mode of death. This is a model from JAMA of patterns of functional decline, and there were 4 patterns that they had in the paper, but there are 2 of them that I think are appropriate here. This is the chronic disease decline, where you kind of have these exacerbations, and you recover, but you never quite recover to where you were before. Or you are going down some path, and then you have sudden death. And ICDs only treat one path of that. And I like to talk about this because I think this is where the trade-off comes. I like to show this to audiences, especially in cardiovascular disease, because so often mortality is lumped together as one endpoint. But mortality can actually look very different. And I always worry that I'll come off as a nihilistic geriatrician when I present these things. I have 3 daughters. I'd get an ICD if I had heart failure, but there's a time in my life where sudden death might not be a bad thing, and I hear that from patients in my clinic. Well, I don't want a lot of things done. If I were to die suddenly, that'd be fine. I want to die in my sleep. And I think that's the discussion we should be having about these things is here's the trade-off you're making. And here's a patient that we interviewed in one of our qualitative studies who basically said that. He was a very savvy patient. He was a hospital chaplain for years earlier. He said he declined at ICD, and he said, going into my decision is also the fact that I can't work because of my medical condition. I can't work at the hospital. I can't work at the church. My life is sitting here watching TV. To take a defibrillator would just lengthen the process I don't really want lengthened. Excuse me. So we did another survey with, we teamed up with Duke and did a national survey of the American College of Cardiology. And we got 1,200 responses, which was actually about a 12% response rate. So there's some weakness there. But we asked them, to what extent do each of these factors affect your recommendations regarding ICDs for primary prevention? And we really wanted to get at how important people thought preference was. And we knew if we asked how important is preference outright, there's a social acceptability bias. Everybody knows patient preferences are important. So there's some data when you do surveys, if you have something like that and put it in a list of other things, you're more likely to get an honest answer. So you can see we had these on a 5-point Likert scale and scored them 0 to 4. And you see mortality data and guidelines are nearly 4 out of 4. And then you see patient preference for the device was 2.9 out of 4. And it was somewhat bimodal, with younger clinicians thinking it more 4 out of 4, and some of the older clinicians thinking it 2 out of 4. And patients' understanding or knowledge about the ICDs was 2.2 out of 4. And I would argue, and we'll talk about this, if you're really sharing a decision, your clinician, mortality data and guidelines should be 4 out of 4. But that other half of the share, the patient's understanding, the patient's preferences and values, those should also be up pretty high, near 4 out of 4. And then if you bring those together, then you're really sharing a decision. So also in that Kaiser survey, there were some other findings I was just going to highlight here. 59% said the ICD should never be turned off. We had a question of when is it appropriate to turn off an ICD, and over half didn't realize that it was ever appropriate to turn off an ICD. 36% weren't asked if they wanted an ICD, or at least don't remember. 17% didn't want it, and 16% said they were involved less than they wanted to be in the decision making. And this is Kaiser. There's not an incentive to put these things in there. There's actually an incentive to not put them in there. So this is potentially a best case scenario. But this, in some of our prior qualitative work, this is one of the themes that really changed how I talked about this. And this came up in dinner last night with Neil and Faisal. This came up in a lot of the interviews when asking about discussions in ICDs, I think this is from the clinicians. I think my biggest concern is if I convey the risk to them too strongly, that they will choose or make an unwise decision and not proceed with therapy. And I say it changed me because it kind of made me realize that everybody's trying to do what's right. It's not that people aren't informing patients, it's that there's this belief. And this was also a physician in a capitated system. He's an electrophysiologist, no incentive to put these things in. It's just this belief that this is right. And I think this is where the challenge comes. I mean, I call this paternalism, and this is paternalism in the best sense of the word. This is how I behave when I protect my children from things. But I'm not sure this is how I want people talking to my father about his defibrillator. But I think that's where this interesting discussion and debate comes. So this first section is why shared decision making. I think there's some important sort of trends going on in society around patients and patients' involvement that we in medicine haven't really been on top of. And this was a great paper in Health Affairs that Dominic Frosch published, where he did focus groups of patients asking, why don't you question your doctors? Or what is it that's keeping you from talking to your doctors? And this is one quote from one of those focus groups. Is the guy going to be pissed at me for not doing what he wanted? Is he going to come out in some way that's going to lower the quality of my treatment? Will he do what I want, resent it, and therefore not quite be as good, or in some way detrimental to my quality of care? And those focus groups also came up with this difficult patient. For those who watch Seinfeld, there was an episode where Elaine, the doc, walks out of the room and Elaine looks at her chart and it says at the top, difficult patient. It's not a surprise. And the doc comes back in and she confronts him. And he's like, oh, that's a mistake. And he pretends to erase it. And she says, that was in pen. You just pen erased. But this is a big fear. This is a big fear. Patients don't want to question us because they're scared of being labeled a difficult patient. And so then I think this is the consequence of us not doing a better job. This is the front of a BMJ, and it was let the patient revolution begin. And you see the research I do. When I first saw this, I was like, oh, that's great. A whole issue on this. And then we were at the International Shared Decision Making meeting in Peru, and there was a human rights ICU physician who was one of the keynotes there from Peru, and he puts a slide up and he says, look at this. He says, look how awful this is. This isn't what patients want. Certainly doctors don't want to be on the receiving end of a revolt. And look at this iconography. Think how much suffering happened from this kind of iconography in the last century. And it really struck me because he was right. This isn't what anybody wants. But you see this, there's books, Let the Patient Revolution Begin. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to be on the receiving end of a patient revolt. So this is, I think, where this shared decision-making has kind of come from, is we've got to figure out how to incorporate patients a little more in some of their major decisions. So I told you that first section's a little preachy. Tried to have some data in there. But now getting into some of the research we've done, we'll just do a time check. All right. What are shared decision-making and patient decision aids? So this is not shared decision-making, but I think this is where the conversation falls down a little bit, is this fear that a shared decision-making or decision aids is you just throw options at a patient and let them choose. What is that? Oh. Oh, it's a phone. Sorry. I thought there was a fire alarm or something. Anyway, I think this is some of the fear of what shared decision making is. But this is my favorite definition of shared decision making, and I'll show you a more modern definition, but I still like this best. It's a meeting between experts. And I like this because it allows a lot of flexibility for what happens in the discussion, but it just acknowledges that you have two experts coming together to make a decision about what's right for them. You go too far one end, we have the familiar model of paternalism, but you go too far the other end and you have this model of consumerism. And Timothy Quill, who's a sort of ethics palliative care guy, I think at Rochester, he wrote an article where he actually called this patient abandonment. And I think that's right, just throwing options at a patient and having them choose. That's not sharing a decision with them. That's just throwing options at them and having them choose. This is a pretty current definition that the National Quality Forum came out with, and we don't need to read it. I'm happy to share slides with anybody who wants them afterwards. But they basically say shared decision making has three components: clear evidence, clear medical evidence, clinician expertise in communicating and tailoring that evidence to patients, which I think is the piece that gets lost a little bit, and then patients' values, goals, and preferences. And you bring those together and you have a shared decision. So I often get asked, what outcomes do you shoot for in shared decision making? And I think the pie in the sky outcome is this construct of decision quality. And it has two domains. It's the idea that a patient makes an informed decision and makes a decision that's concordant with their values. So you see this if you have higher knowledge, but it's not value concordant. I'm not sure what to make of that. And if you have value concordance, but it's not very well informed, I'm not sure if that's a bad decision either. But certainly trying to push up and to the right is the outcome that a lot of people who do this kind of science try to measure. So tools, there are decision aids, and the International Patient Decision Aid Standards say that decision aids really have four big sections. They provide information about options, they present probabilities in an unbiased and understandable way, provide some method for clarifying values, and that's probably the area with the least developed science behind this, and then structured guidance for deliberation and communication. So there's a Cochrane review, it's a typo, it's actually 105 trials of decision aids, not 115, that show that decision aids in these efficacy trials improve lots of these kinds of outcomes: knowledge, communication, involvement, satisfaction, value treatment concordance. They lower conflict, they lower regret, and they lower the proportion undecided. And it's pretty robust Cochrane review, I would argue. But I hinted to what I think the big criticism, my criticism is of it, is that these are all efficacy trials. Very few pragmatic trials of how do you do it in the real world. It's really easy to make a nice tool, have a research assistant sit with a patient and improve a patient's knowledge. It's actually a pretty easy thing to do. It's really hard to think about how do you take something and get that integrated in real world clinical practice. So in designing of these tools, there's lots of steps. And I like to talk about a little bit of this. Erica Spatz and I wrote a paper in Circulation CQO about how you make and design these tools. But essentially, you do some evidence review, and then you need to understand the decision needs. What are the needs of these decision makers? And you take those things together and you make a prototype. And then I think you can call this lots of things, but it's essentially a user-centered design where you rapidly prototype based on potential end users, patients and clinicians. And then you get a final decision aid. And I actually think part of the failure of decision aids 1.0 is that they were designed just for patients with very little consideration of the things the clinician's decision needs and the things clinicians wanted to say. And that's why these things are sitting on shelves, because they didn't meet what clinicians needed. So our group, we try to actually design for both, which creates complications because it's hard. The two different users with two different needs. Clinicians often want a little more nuance and know the nuance. Patients need the simplicity, and that's just a tension we carry as we design our tools. So here's back to that SCUD-HEF data. I'm going to show some other ways to present that. But before I do, I want to talk about this experiment. This is a really famous experiment from Kahneman and Tversky, published in Science in 1981. And this talks about framing effects. Some of you may have heard this. It's a pretty famous, it's part of what led to Dan Kahneman winning the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics, is this kind of experiment. But he said, imagine the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual Asian disease that's going to kill 600 people. There are two alternatives to combat this disease. And then they surveyed, I think these were med students, and half of them got the top presentation and half got the bottom presentation. And if you look, they're identical. Program A, 200 people will be saved, or Program A, 400 people will die. Program B, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, or Program B, a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So you see they're identical, except the difference is the people at the top are getting the saved, and the people at the bottom are getting the lost, the die. So this is basically gain frame, lost frame. In one choice, you're gaining things. In one choice, you're losing things. And here's how they chose. If you were given this presented in the top way, 3/4 of people chose the conservative option. If you were given this in the bottom, 3/4 of people chose the risky option. And these are clinicians. These are future clinicians, medical students. And this is what led to the Nobel Prizes, because this is highly reproducible. We are conservative when faced with gains, and we are risky when faced with losses. And this leads to all kinds of other decisions. If you think of the gain framing, this is why when you go to Best Buy and buy a $100 Blu-ray player, they offer you that $15 insurance. That little insurance is the highest profit margin for Best Buy. And it's because you just gained something, so now you're willing to spend a little more. You're very conservative. So buying insurance is a conservative thing to do. And if you think that Blu-ray has a 15% chance of failing in the next year, you should probably go buy a different Blu-ray player. And likewise, this bottom one is more familiar. This is the gambling problem, the double or nothing. I just lost. Let's do it again. Let's take another risk and see if we can do it. And this has been shown over and over in many experiments, but this is one of the most famous. So how do we take, if we know this, that one word can change the decision this much, how do we use that in the tools we design? Well, here's that scud heft data again. And this is an icon array or a pictograph, the 100 faces. And you see there's the 7 green faces. That's at 7% absolute risk reduction over 5 years. And you see we say 29 die, 71 live, 36 die, 64 live, trying to avoid some sort of framing effect. I'm not talking about our LVAD stuff very much because I know Larry Allen was here a year or two ago and talked a lot about that. But we thought a lot in our LVAD tool how to make sure it didn't come off as framed as life versus death. So we framed both arms as life with an LVAD, life without an LVAD, to try and not get into a framing effect, which we knew would be highly influential. So this is now the current figure in our tool. With the Medicare mandate, we've flattened out the line a little bit per some of the feedback we've received. But we're still trying to get people just to understand this trade-off. And you see, we use these competing narratives, and I think this plays a little better. We have a video version to see it in video, but I'm just going to read these quotes to you at the bottom. On the left, path 1, I'm not ready to die. I have so much I'm trying to stay alive for. Even if it means getting shocked, I'm willing to do anything that can help me live longer. Or on the left, I've had a good life. The idea of dying quickly sounds like a painless way to go. I've always said I hope to die in my sleep. Going through surgery and getting shocked is not the kind of thing I want. So we're trying to frame these as both reasonable options for people, and then using these sort of competing narratives to help people clarify what's right for them. And then this is where we lost some points with the decision aid crowd because we violated decision aid rules with how we presented the risks. So I showed you that pictograph of the 100 faces, but we had a pictograph of the risks, and I remember John Rumsfeld, one of the docs in our group, said, if you did that, I would never let my patients see that. And he's a pretty forward-thinking cardiologist for those who know him. So we put the risks as bullet points, 4 out of 100 patients, some bleeding, 2 out of 100 have a serious problem, and 1 out of 100 develop an infection. If you add those up, that's 7. And so when we did the pictures, it looked like a wash. 7 green faces, 7 red faces. We didn't want to do that because there's an apple and an orange. Preventing sudden death is very different than a little bleeding after a procedure. So we have these as bullet points, and these are highly contentious. And the literature on this is terrible. Everybody defines complications differently. Major, minor, acute, long-term, and all that. So it's really hard. So these are on the low end of the range. And we still get people saying, oh, our complications are lower. And I've had people come say, oh, I know from the Medicare data we've done that the complications are much higher than that. And this is just one of those challenges in making a tool, is that you'll never make people happy with whatever numbers you choose. You just got to defend the numbers in some way. So this is our website where you can go on. It's free. I'm not trying to sell it. We're not making any money on this. But we've made this freely available where people can come watch the video or download the booklet. And the tools are available in Spanish. We have video vignettes. This is another piece in the design. We use competing narratives in some of our video versions of these tools. And this is a really contentious area in decision tools as well, because narratives can be really biasing. So we choose process narratives and experience narratives, and we make sure to avoid outcome narratives. Somebody says, oh, this is the best thing I've ever done, or this is the worst thing I've ever done. We don't have a patient with a VT storm in there, because that would be very biasing against, but that's the hard part in choosing narratives, and we just spent hours and hours trying to find the right narratives that we thought would represent some of the main things without being overly biasing in one way or the other. But there are some people who think you shouldn't use narratives and tools. We just hear from patients all the time that they want to hear from other patients. And so we've decided to do that. And also, people can find narratives online, and so we thought this was a way, if we could choose the narratives, we could control the narratives people see. So we studied these tools in a pilot trial. We found them feasible in 3 practice settings. We found that when clinic staff delivered the tools, that was what the best way to do the trial. When we had research assistants trying to identify patients, we could do that, but it wasn't nearly as effective as having the clinics do it themselves. And that's a teaser to kind of get into where we went, is that into the implementation science angle that we've gone into. Patients felt the decision aids were helpful and balanced. They'd recommend them to other patients. There were non-significant trends and improvements in decision quality. It's a pilot trial, so we didn't really have power to test that. And patients preferred the paper and video. We made this expensive interactive website and nobody used it, which is kind of nice, because now we're not doing the expensive interactive websites anymore. We're just going to do paper tools and a video is what we've done for a lot of these things. And clinicians wanted decision aids related to reimplantation and BIV pacing. And it's interesting, when in the design of these things, the hardest thing to get is balance. And we've got these ICD tools where patients tell us it's biased towards the ICD. Clinicians are worried it's biased against the ICD. But we think, through the iterative testing, we think we're close to something that's pretty well balanced. But we've never got everybody to just agree on that. So then I'll get into the last area of how do you implement shared decision making, and I'll talk about our R01 and the trial that we're doing right now to implement shared decision making and patient decision aids. So last year, the ACC AHA HRS guidelines came out, and they said shared decision making for ICDs is a class 1 indication. And more guidelines are saying this. But you look at the level of evidence is B, non-randomized. It's one of those things, we were talking about this also at dinner last night. There's consensus that it's good, but there's very little data on how effective it is or how do you do this. And so this is where I think a lot of the energy around this topic happened is, and this surprised me too, I had no idea this was coming, that Medicare mandated shared decision-making for defibrillators. And they said you needed an evidence-based decision tool on ICDs prior to implantation. And in that, they actually referenced our tool as an example of a tool, which is very flattering. Again, we weren't ready for it, but you can see the dates. This is our Google Analytics from our website. We had very few people using our tools prior to that. And then that mandate comes out, or the February 16th was when the proposed NCD covers out, the National Coverage Decision. And then you can see how we just had this increased use. It drops every weekend. That's what those dips are. Nobody's using the tools on Saturday and Sunday, which is probably good. I'm not either. But this is the challenge with decision tools. I don't think the challenge is can a tool help a patient make a better decision? I actually am kind of bought into that Cochrane review that these tools are good. And I think you can debate that a little bit, but I think in general, you can, if you go through a rigorous development process, you can design a tool that'll help patients understand. I think the hard part is all of these kinds of questions. Who's going to use the tool? Is it a provider or a staff member? Will that staff member be empowered to use the tool? What is the effect of having a staff member do it? How will it be delivered electronically? Will you do it in person or mailed? Is it going to be in clinic or out of clinic? And I think medical decisions require different depths of deliberation. For our LVAD tool, we have a 26-minute video, and we heard from patients in the ICU that they wished it was longer with more patients' experiences. And I worked with somebody else doing colon cancer stuff in primary care, and we had a 2-minute little video, and they felt it was too long. I just want something even shorter. And I think you got to design for each context. So this idea that there's one model of a decision aid that's going to fit each decision, I think is not correct. I think every decision is a little bit different with lots of nuances, and you've got to design for those contextual differences. There's a big difference between daily reversible decisions like a medication versus something like an ICD or an LVAD. And then I think this is the hardest piece, is when should you deliver the decision aid? Because ideally, you would use this when that patient's in their head thinking about the decision. But when do they do that? I don't really know. This is another thing that was so easy about the LVADs, is they didn't know about it till they got to the ICU, and then they were captive. And we knew when they were in the decision window. But as we've been trying to implement for ICDs, is it somewhere between the referral from the primary care to the cardiologist? Or is it somewhere between the cardiologist and the EP? We think that's the decision window, somewhere in there. But we don't know. In the qualitative study that I did, cardiologists would say things like, oh, I let the EPs have that discussion. And the EPs would say things like, oh, by the time they've come to see me, they've already made up their mind. So I'm not really sure who's owning that discussion or where's the best place for that. There was a systematic review of implementation of decision aids, and you can see by the title, Many Miles to Go. That basically sums it up. And clinicians lack confidence in the content of the tools. There were many concerns about decision aids disrupting established workflows, and lack of incentives were a major barrier. Actually, this is partly why we've been excited working with the American College of Cardiology on tools. Not only are they a pretty good organization with a lot of interest in this space, but there's some data as well that if a tool is endorsed by a specialty society, the community will be more likely to trust the information in it. And so I think that's some of the value. And again, there's some people in the decision aid world that have written things that said specialty societies should not be involved in shared decision making at all. And I think that's just absolutely incorrect. We have to engage everybody in doing this stuff. And I think they're concerned about overly biased, but that's kind of what led to this first mandate for the Watchman, where they said shared decision making needs to happen, but by a non-interventionalist clinician. I think that is completely incorrect in how to move these things forward. So this is why I think we need implementation science. This is a slide I stole from Russ Glasgow. He's really compelling. He's a big implementation scientist, for those who know, but he's really compelling when he talks about why we need implementation science. But traditional RCTs are slow. I could have written an R01 to do an efficacy trial of the ICD decision aid and then be implementing 5 years from now. But the other argument with RCTs is they rarely produce findings that are easily put into practice. When you have a research assistant delivering a tool, that's not really something that's implementable. And this is the commonly quoted statistics. It takes 17 years before 14% of research findings lead to widespread changes in care. So this is a cardiology audience. The NHLBI has invested a ton over the last 4 or 5 years in implementation science. There's this new CITRIS, the Center for Translation Research and Implementation Science. They just funded 9 NHLBI-funded K-12 programs around the country for implementation science. They're funding lots of R01s. They have a pretty big budget. I think they're going to pass the NCI. I think NHLBI is going to pass the NCI on implementation science. I'm just going to skip this and move on to this. So this is our design. Right now we have an R01 funded by them to implement our ICD tool using this step wedge design. This is a quasi-experimental design where you randomize not by patient, but you randomize when the site gets the intervention. And then you roll it out sequentially over time. And we are currently just right between phase 2 and phase 3. So we've rolled it out at a couple sites. And then you can test effectiveness by comparing the control to the intervention. So people start in the control group, and we're measuring all of these outcomes, and then you test it again in the intervention. And this is where this Medicare mandate completely ruined this trial, because basically all of our sites that are supposed to be in the control now are now contaminated by this mandate. We actually had a phone call with CMS the Heart Rhythm Society and the ACC lobbyists actually helped us put together a case to CMS about would they grant a waiver of this mandate from the sites in the trial. And CMS, to their credit, was really thoughtful. We had a phone call with them. They had 6 people there, and they said, we've reviewed your proposal. We really want to do this, but we can't. We'd have to go through a whole new public comment period. And by then, you would be all the way through. We kind of wrote this ironclad. And what we're going to do in future mandates is we're going to try to allow more room for evidence. But unfortunately, we can't do that here. So I don't know if we're going to be able to measure effectiveness at all. But then we called this an effectiveness implementation hybrid. An advantage of the step wedge design is you can study implementation as you go. At each site, we go and implement at the site. And we're not measuring fidelity to this intervention. We're just saying people need to use it, and they need to use it before they meet the EP. But we're letting each site decide what is the best way to do that. One site's having their nurse mail it. One site has these nurse closers at their visits that are implementing it when the physician's done in general cardiology, when the referral happens. And then we're going to study with a mixed methods approach how that happens as we go. I'll talk about that a little bit. So we're going to learn a lot about how to implement. I don't know if we're going to be able to make any assertions about effectiveness. So we're using this, I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation science for those who are interested. Implementation science has all of these frameworks. This is the REAIM framework that we're using. This was developed by Russ Glasgow, who's the director of our implementation science program in Colorado. He's a really great guy. But these are also some of his slides that I've stolen, just to talk about what REAIM is. Each letter stands for something. But just think about this. So let's say you have an intervention, and 50% of the clinics use your intervention. That's pretty good if you make something and half of the clinics decide to use it. And at those clinics, half of the staff decide to use it. So that's adoption. That's the A in the REAIM. Then, after of those docs, they're able to effectively get that intervention to half of the eligible patients. That's the REACH. That's the R of REAIM. And then when those patients get it, half of them use it correctly. That's the I. That's the implementation of REAIM. And then of those who use it correctly, about half benefit, which is a pretty high number for most therapies we do. And that's effectiveness. And then after you're done, after your grant's done, half of the clinics are still using it. And they continue to benefit. That's maintenance. Maintenance is both the staff level, clinics use it, and the patient level, do they still benefit from it? But if you look at the overall impact on the right, if that's what you kind of get this reduction at each level where by the end, only about 1.6% of people are using it. So I think this is a compelling argument for why not just thinking about effectiveness is the way to go, is if you can think about these other things. How do you reach people? How do you make something that's adoptable? How do you help people implement? How do you make something that has maintenance when the money's gone? That's why I think trying to think about these things all together is probably a better way to go. It's just a lot messier science. So this is how we're measuring this in this ICD trial. For the REACH, we're just simply measuring those who received the intervention over those who were eligible. And this is conceptually very easy, and in practice, it is really hard to know who that denominator is, especially in the ICD space. It's really hard to figure out who is eligible until they come, and we can't just use those who got the intervention because there may be some eligible who didn't. And really, we're having a really hard time figuring out how to find those. We have a few different assumptions about that, but it's really hard. But that's what REACH is, and we're trying to measure that. For effectiveness, we're using that outcome I talked about earlier, decision quality. We're measuring knowledge and value treatment concordance and some secondary outcomes. For adoption and implementation, this is more of a mixed methods evaluation. It's an R01, so adoption is a bit artificial. We approached 7 sites and 6 agreed to participate, so that's about 86% adoption. In the real world, real implementation work, adoption's different than that. When you write an R01, you need letters from sites that agree to participate. But we are going to study implementation, and like I said, we're letting sites do this however they want with just a couple core elements rather than typical research where you have fidelity to do the intervention. We just have fidelity to a couple core elements, and then we're studying the ways they adapt. And that fidelity versus adaptation, that's one of those implementation science constructs that you should be really thoughtful about. And then maintenance. This is the most important thing. It's kind of easy when we're sending sites money to say you should do this, but when the money's gone, our site's going to continue to do this. And now with this mandate, of course, they'll continue to do it. So I think it's how well will they continue to do it? And we're thinking about how we're going to relook at this in the last year of the trial. But this is one of these things. I think the cardiologists have been picked on a lot here. Medicare's done this 3 times. They've done it for lung cancer screening, and then they've mandated shared decision-making for the left atrial appendage closure device, and then again for ICDs. And it looks like the TAVR document is out now, and it has language about shared decision-making. It's up for public comment. So if you don't like it, now's the time to go on and make a comment about it. But this is a picture of the Grand Canyon. I do like, we were talking a little bit about this at dinner last night too, is I like to do the tools and the science, but really I like to think about the culture. I start the talk off about why shared decision making and how we need to do a better job. And I really like the fact that now, because of this mandate, we're having more discussions about it. And I like water as an analogy for culture change, because it's just kind of slow, kind of runs continuously, and then over a long period of time, you get these things. And I do think that's a bit of our challenge in medicine, is to kind of bring back that human element in the setting of all these amazing technologies that we have. But that's it. I think that leaves about 10 minutes for questions. And I just say for a minute, we really have an amazing team in Colorado. I think team science is a bit of luck. You just get a bunch of people with a shared vision and different skills that agree to work together. Larry Allen and I argue all the time, but because we both have this shared mission, we can go have a beer and work it out. And I think that's how team science happens. You don't really fight about these little academic things. And we've been lucky to have a team that has done this. But anyway, that's it. I'll stop there.
Great. So I'm sure people have questions, but I'll start. So one question I had. So when your sort of control group got regulated out, so what's in the step wedge design that you guys are doing? What's the sort of shift? What are people starting with, and then what are they moving to? I know you said they had some latitude.
Yeah. So we asked the sites need to do something. So we asked them to use just a paper version of the tool. We talked to our DSMB. They didn't want us to not. It wasn't really ethical to say, oh, use some lower quality tool. So they can use whatever they want. We asked them to kind of just use the paper tools if they need to implement something and not use the video. We know from our prior trial the videos are a lot more popular with the patients. So those are 2 ways we handled it. But we're just studying what they're doing. There's nothing we can really do about it. We can't mandate it. And even in our design, as you see, we're not mandating what they do. We're just studying what they do. And so, yeah. So it's going to be sort of a no support implementation versus a supported implementation. And so if we find effectiveness there, great. Then that even helps more. But it's going to be hard. And we're going to have some secondary on-treatment analyses that are going to be dubious. And we'll see what we get. It's disappointing, but it's also interesting from the implementation side. So our project officer, luckily we're with that Citrus at the NHLBI, and they're pretty excited in one hand because we'll study this. We'll just study the implementation. So if we had had a clinical trial section in project officer, I think they may even be talking about shutting us down. But this NHLBI group isn't thinking that way. So, yes, sir.
Thank you for the work you're doing. This area is extremely complex, and a number of people have attempted to simplify it. And some of that simplification, I think, is resulting in mandates by the government that may ultimately interfere with the patient-doctor relationship and in good outcomes and in good medicine. So one thing is the terminology. So the terminology is that we are using evidence-based decision aids, okay? Now, this does not mean that a decision aid has been used and that there's evidence that it actually improves outcome, that it reduces anxiety, that it improves how a patient feels about things, that sort of thing. What an evidence-based decision aid is where it takes a trial and then creates an aid around that for a patient to look at that. Now, let's take the example of ICD therapy. So you show the SCUD-HAF trial data, and that starts to get used for decision to get an ICD. Now, if there's a 30-year-old who had a massive anterior myocardial infarction and has a huge amount of scar, but recovers from that and has very mild symptoms of heart failure, there are trials for those patients, right? The post-MI trials. But there are also trials where patients may fall into a higher risk category,
Yeah.
and they are being shown data that is just for a group of patients. There are also many, many patients who did not qualify for that trial. So patients with end-stage renal disease, yada, yada, yada. But so as these decision aids are based upon data, often the patient that we're talking to may not fit into the data. And so how do we deal with that? How do we speak up about that? But this stuff is, we had a presentation here sponsored through our ethics group. A guy named Thaddeus Pope spoke, and I was horrified at what he presented, because he basically said physicians do a terrible job at this, and we need to take this out of the realm of the physicians and use, and there's thousands of decision aids that have been proven to be evidence-based, and yet all these societies are speaking out against them. And he was, basically he was saying, societies just need to get on board.
Yeah.
So, again, I like the work you're doing. It may have some unintended consequences of actually not having favorable outcomes long term, but you're very thoughtful, I think, in looking at that. But everybody in the room needs to be aware of the movement that is going on related to this. And you showed 36% of patients did not recall having a discussion. There have been trials where they videoed patients where they had a discussion with somebody and then asked them later, were you ever informed of this? And they're like,
Right.
no, of course not. Well, let's go back and look at this video where you were informed. But the bias there is that physicians aren't telling their patients
Right.
things.
Oh, I think there's a lot of bias in the shared decision-making community against physicians. I think you're right on that. A couple points. So I think when Medicare used the word evidence-based decision aid, they actually didn't say what they meant. And I wondered, did they mean it's based on trial evidence, or do they mean a decision aid with evidence? So you kind of went, I don't think they say, and I've looked for that. I actually think it should be a little bit of both. It should be based on evidence, and the tools should have some evidence. But they don't specify. And what you said is one of the common questions I get is, well, what about a MADE-1 patient with a 15% absolute risk reduction versus, say, a Danish patient who may not have an absolute risk reduction? We're actually, in our R01 trial, we're asking each patient that's enrolled, we're asking the physician to say, how appropriate do you think shared decision-making was for this patient? And we're getting good response rates on that. It's only a couple questions, but with the idea that 50-year-old MADE-1 with a twitchy heart and is very different than the 85-year-old dilated cardiomyopathy with a lot of multimorbidity. It's not just one decision, it's this spectrum of decisions. So I think you're right on there. As far as the tools go, I don't know. I think, we were talking about this last night too, I think the tailored numbers may or may not influence the patients that much. Whether it's 7 out of 100 or 10 out of 100, I think they're gonna make the decision based on some other value trade-offs. I do think that would help the physicians feel a lot more comfortable with the tools if the data we were presenting was better. So we say in our tool something along the lines of, this is data from a population, have a discussion with your physician about your individual circumstances, because we acknowledge that concern, but it's not very satisfying. Ideally, we'd have some tool online where we could give some sort of tailored statistics, but then the flip side of that is now you have an implementation challenge where giving a paper tool is a lot easier than some sort of online tool. So it's that tension, again, that I was talking about of designing for the patients, designing for the clinicians. Ideally doing both, but you're right on. And I hope in some of our future work to kind of get into some of this more tailored presentation, because I do think that's what we need. But I think it's a fair concern. Yeah.
Dan, thanks so much. Could you go back to the slide that showed path 1 and path 2 with the Lunny work? There's this framing of something called states worse than death. And I think that what you've got on the y-axes here are feel healthy, feel sicker, and death. And in the initial Lunny article, which you referenced, Joanne Lynn came and talked about that article here
Yeah.
too. What's really on the y-axis is really basic
Function.
activities of daily living and
Yeah.
impairments that are inability to walk across the room, inability to dress yourself, inability to get to the toilet. And when Joanne Lynn was here, she talked about the fact that as a medical community, we're eliminating all the good causes of death. The causes of death where you live a ripe and robust life and then you die with still function remaining. And so I know that when you simplify decision tools, you take some, you try and make it simpler, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about this y-axis here, which is really nutty things about being confined to your bed and unable to get up and unable to dress yourself and being incontinent in bed. And are we trading off, dying at 88, relatively functional versus living to 93, being physically dependent for 2 years in and out of the hospital a lot?
Right. Yeah, I know those are based on function, and we have feel healthy, feel sicker, and death, because that's in our iterative review what the patients kind of understood. But I think the purpose of showing it this way, this has been the hardest piece of this, is how do you communicate this particular trade-off, which I think is one of the key trade-offs that patients are making, is you will potentially die. You won't live as long, but you may die quickly. And this, about half of the patients really liked the graphs for showing that. About half didn't really understand the graphs. So it kind of came from that iterative process. But I think if I understand what you're asking, you're wondering, is putting feel healthy, feel sicker the right thing to do on the y-axis? Yeah, I don't know. That came from the patient feedback, that's something that they understood. It is function in that Lunny article. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So we learn things by learning from opposites. Sorry. So we learn things by learning from opposites. So as I was listening to you present this, and that was great, I would say, and what is the opposite of what he's talking about? And one of the opposites is a used car salesman. You know, if you walk into that lot, that used car salesman is not on your side. So one of the things that we have to do as physicians is to try to create a situation in which the patient thinks that we are on their side, that we are not up here and they're down here, but we try to make that equal. And that means we try to make them understand what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And make them understand that in the end, we're really on their side. So we go through this process. That's an effort toward that goal.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. I like that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, this is another interesting comment, I guess, not to explain anything, but so much is dependent in my observation, particularly in trials. So when you get people, you're enrolling them into a trial, it's how they are presented with the options. So that's very similar to, in real life decisions. So are there any studies where you do inter-observer, I don't know how you would do this, but you'd like to, if you think about therapies, you'd say, well, we deliver this therapy and we'll see what the reaction is. But in in this decision-making, I don't know how you would structure this, but I'd love to see something where one person or one process is presented, interaction with the patient, and then another kind of process is presented, and see if the decisions are different. Because so much I see, give you an example of coronary interventions. So I see people present a whole case, and then the patient has multivessel disease, and the decision is the patient doesn't want surgery, so we're going straight for angioplasty. And you say, oh my God, how would they ever do this? So you wonder what goes into this information that's given to the patient. And you realize that some other group would give very different information.
Oh, yeah.
In the final analysis, the patient ends up saying, well, doc, what would you do if it was you? And so much of it seems to be, and I wonder how in the world could you measure the impact of how, you point out the relative reduction and the absolute reduction, all these kind of things are important, but it seems like the bias of the presenter is so important that I don't know how you get around that.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to do some observed encounters or something. It gets, one of the groups that came to decision aids is the Dartmouth group from the practice variation literature. And they said maybe to lower variation, we should have standardized information. Kind of thinking just that, if we could standardize how people get information, maybe you'd have less variability. But you're absolutely right, I think it's a huge function of that presenter.
Heretical comment. So much is based on a study that from 2005, the Scott-Half study. Does that science still apply today? Treatment's different. Do we need to address economic issues? We need to address why implant rates in the U.S. are much higher than other Western countries. Why is that? I mean, are the Germans suffering because of fewer implants? So we're spending lots of money based on a study published in '05. Maybe we should take some of that money and repeat the study.
Well, there's lots of interesting comments there. I definitely avoided any sort of financial discussions in any of the tools we've made. Actually, Neil's kind of getting into that. That's good. He can do that. But it's an interesting comment, yeah.
I think we're at time, but I hope everybody will join me in thanking Dan for a great presentation and for coming to join us.
Thank you all.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.